In the winter of 1846, a group of American families became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains beneath impossible snow. At first, they believed rescue would arrive within days. It did not. Weeks passed, then months. Food disappeared. Oxen collapsed in the snow. Children starved beside frozen campfires. And eventually, some members of the Donner Party began eating the dead to survive. More than 170 years later, the story still remains one of the most horrifying survival disasters in American history. Not because the wilderness killed them quickly, but because it did not. The journey west began with optimism. Hundreds of wagons moved across the American frontier during the spring of 1846. Families dreamed of fertile land in California, new opportunity, a better life beyond the mountains. Among them traveled the Donner Party, a wagon group led primarily by brothers George Donner and Jacob Donner, farmers, parents, children, ordinary people chasing the promise of the American West. At first, the journey followed established migration trails used by thousands before them. Conditions were difficult, but manageable. The wagon train crossed rivers, mud, heat, endless plains stretching beyond the horizon. Campfires illuminated the night while children played near wagons beneath open sky. Many believed California was only a matter of time, but the American frontier had a way of punishing confidence. During the journey, the Donner Party chose to follow a newly promoted shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. The route promised a faster path to California. Letters and promotional claims described it as shorter and more efficient than the traditional trail. But few immigrants had ever crossed it successfully with wagons. The shortcut became a disaster almost immediately. The terrain turned brutal. Dry salt flats stretched endlessly beneath burning heat. Wagon wheels cracked, animals weakened, water vanished. Progress slowed dramatically. At times, the emigrants moved only a few miles per day. The mountains ahead grew closer while valuable weeks disappeared behind them, and every lost week pushed the travelers closer to winter. Arguments spread through the wagon train. Some blamed poor leadership. Others wanted to abandon the shortcut entirely. But turning back now seemed impossible, so the group continued forward into worsening conditions. By the time the Donner Party finally approached the Sierra Nevada mountains, snow had already begun falling. The first storm arrived suddenly. Heavy snow buried the mountain passes before the wagons could escape. Within days, the route west disappeared completely beneath ice and snow. The emigrants were trapped. At first, many believed the storm would pass quickly. It did not. More snow followed, then more. Soon drifts rose higher than the wagons themselves. The mountains transformed into frozen walls surrounding the camp from every direction. Escape became impossible. The travelers built crude shelters from logs, wagon parts, and animal hides. Cabins formed beside frozen trees while smoke drifted weakly into the winter sky. Inside those shelters, families waited for rescue. Food supplies rapidly collapsed. Oxen were slaughtered first, then horses, then dogs. Leather hides were boiled into soup. Bones were crushed for grease and marrow. Anything remotely edible became precious. Children cried through the night from hunger. Adults weakened so severely they could barely stand outside in the snow. The cold entered everything. Blankets froze stiff. Breath crystallized inside cabins. Snow buried rooftops, while storms shook the mountains endlessly around them. Some survivors later described hearing wind scream through the trees for hours without stopping. The wilderness felt alive, hostile, endless. As starvation worsened, death became common. The first bodies were buried beneath snow near the camp, but the ground itself had frozen too hard to dig properly. Many corpses remained only partially covered beneath the wilderness. Families watched loved ones disappear slowly from starvation and exposure. Mothers lost children. Children lost parents. The mountains showed no mercy to any of them. Inside the cabins, silence slowly replaced conversation. People became too weak to speak for long. Faces hollowed, skin tightened around bone, eyes sank deeper each passing week. The smell of sickness and smoke filled the shelters constantly. Some survivors later recalled hearing starving children whisper about food while sleeping. Others described people staring silently into fires for hours without movement. Time itself began to disappear. The snow outside never stopped. Eventually, some members of the camp realized waiting meant death. A small rescue party attempted to cross the mountains on foot through deep snow. The group later became known as the Forlorn Hope. The name itself revealed everything about their situation. The journey through the mountains became a nightmare almost immediately. Blizzards destroyed visibility. Snow reached chest height. Starving travelers collapsed one by one into the wilderness. Some froze to death during the night beside weak campfires. Others became too exhausted to continue walking. The survivors understood something terrifying. Without food, none of them would survive. At first, many still believed rescue remained possible. They pushed themselves through snowdrifts while carrying almost no supplies. But starvation destroys the body quickly. People stopped recognizing one another beneath frost and exhaustion. Voices weakened, movements slowed, the mountains swallowed sound itself beneath endless white silence. Then came the moment that transformed the Donner Party into legend. After several members of the rescue group died, the survivors began consuming human flesh to stay alive. At first, many resisted the idea completely, but starvation destroys civilization slowly. The body stops thinking about morality, it only thinks about survival. Frozen human remains became food. The mountains had reduced ordinary families into desperate survivors, trapped beyond the limits of human endurance. Back at the main camps, conditions continued deteriorating. Starvation hollowed faces. Children became too weak to move. Some adults wandered outside during storms and never returned. Others sat silently beside fires without speaking for hours. Witnesses later described the camps as places filled with hopelessness and silence. Snow surrounded everything. White mountains, white trees, white death stretching endlessly across the wilderness. Inside one cabin, a mother reportedly sat beside the bodies of her dead children, while storms buried the camp outside. Another survivor later described people becoming too weak to even mourn properly. Death no longer arrived as shock, it became routine. The living slept beside the dead because there was nowhere else to place the bodies. As conditions worsened, fear began spreading through the camps. Not only fear of starvation, but fear of what starvation might force people to become. Some survivors avoided sleeping deeply at night. Others guarded food desperately, even when almost nothing remained. The psychological collapse became nearly as terrifying as the cold itself. Finally, after months trapped in the Sierra Nevada, rescue parties began reaching the camps. The rescuers entered scenes of horror. Emaciated survivors emerged from cabins wrapped in torn blankets and animal hides. Many were barely recognizable as human. Some could no longer walk. Children stared silently from dark shelters beside the bodies of dead relatives, and scattered throughout the camps were signs of cannibalism. Human bones, cooked remains, evidence of what starvation had forced people to become. Not everyone could be rescued immediately. Some survivors remained trapped, while additional rescue attempts struggled through the snow. Several died even after help had finally arrived. One rescue worker later described the camps as places where hope itself seemed frozen beneath the snow. By the end of the disaster, nearly half the Donner Party was dead. Dozens of men, women, and children had vanished into the mountains forever. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Many rarely spoke publicly about what happened in the Sierra Nevada during the winter of 1846. Some attempted rebuilding ordinary lives in California. Others remained haunted by memories of starvation, isolation, and the terrible choices forced upon them. A few survivors became famous throughout America, but fame brought little comfort. The memories followed them forever. Over time, the story of the Donner Party became something larger than a frontier disaster. It became a warning about human overconfidence, a story about desperation, about how quickly civilization collapses when survival itself disappears. Even today, the Sierra Nevada mountains still stand above the old campsites. Cold winter storms still bury the passes beneath snow. Tourists cross roads that once trapped starving families inside the wilderness nearly 2 centuries ago. Most pass through without realizing how many people died there. But beneath the forests and mountains, the memory remains. Families searching for a better future, children freezing beside weak fires, and starving survivors forced to choose between death and the unthinkable. Perhaps that is what makes the Donner Party so disturbing even now. Not the snow, not the mountains, not even the cannibalism itself, but the realization that the people trapped in those camps were ordinary human beings. Parents, children, travelers, people who believed they were only weeks away from a new life. Instead, the mountains turned their journey into one of the darkest survival stories in American history. And somewhere beneath the snow-covered Sierra Nevada, the silence of the Donner Party still lingers in the cold forever.